All right, next up we have Peta Masters and Victoria Young.
Yes, hello. So I'm Peta. I'm from King's College, London, and I'm a computer scientist and researcher there, and did this work with Victoria, who's a social scientist, and with Sachini, who couldn't come but is online. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to put together a library of benchmark use case scenarios that can be used by HRI researchers to evaluate trust. And we do this under the umbrella of the TAS Hub, and we're going to tag team now. So Victoria will explain what that is. Oh, hang on.
Oh, maybe just click.
Got it.
Great. Okay. So the TAS Hub, the Trusted Autonomous Systems Hub, lies at the center of the world's largest research program on trustworthy AI and autonomous systems. It is funded to a total of 38 million euros or $40 million in a 4-year program, and it assembles teams principally from King's College London and the universities of Southampton and Nottingham. There's over 200 researchers involved, over 20 universities, and we investigate each of these 7 different aspects of trust. Our governing vision is to enable the development of socially beneficial autonomous systems that are both trustworthy in principle and trusted in practice, by the public, by government, and by industry.
Okay, so it's quite a big operation, this TAS network, and what we find is all over that network there are lots of different project teams, and they're basically what they're doing is they're making some modification to a robot or some autonomous system and then seeing whether it makes it more or less trustworthy. So the model is more or less like this. There's be some sort of question, how much do you trust robots? And then the human is exposed to some kind of interaction, something happens, and then it's like, well, and how much do you trust it now? So there's lots of work on those two ends, but the piece in the middle, it could be anything. And what tends to happen, because there's no benchmark, is that every team, every time they've got something new they want to evaluate, they make up a new scenario. So it's reasonable. I mean, it's not easy to establish a benchmark for trust. I mean, what is it? And there's no definition, and there's certainly no formal definition. So our approach is, okay, we'll bring all these use cases together. We'll develop an online library, everybody can access it, that everyone can upload the trust case, the user cases that they're using, and they can comment, they can review, they can critique, and the ones that are most useful will bubble to the top, and they will achieve a benchmark status. That's the plan. So we have to try and think, like, okay, well, what are we talking about as we kind of analyze this? So we come up with a kind of model. What will this benchmark look like? What is a benchmark use case scenario for trust? And the specification, obviously, it's a model. We begin with the use case, so something happens. There's the robot does something, the human does something, even if all the human does is observe what the robot did. There's an interaction. That's the use case. For it to be an experimental use case, obviously, you've got to change something and you've got to have some way to measure what was the impact of whatever you change. For it to be anything to do with trust, well, this isn't from us, but we're I've forgotten what the reference is. Lee and C, 2004. That we need in the scenario to have there has to be some kind of risk. There has to be some vulnerability for the human, and they have to have a choice, especially if it's a behavioural measure. Then it can't be that they had no option; they had to do that. There has to have been a choice for us to have that. So, what makes it a benchmark? Well, if we look at, is it transferable you know, if it can only be done, if there's only one variable that this can test, well, okay, it's a use case. But if it begins to be transferable, if you can use it in different domains, different test environments, different variables, then we say, okay, then it will be then it has a benchmark status. So model. We've done a bit of work. So we're not nowhere. We were lucky to have a good data set to start from. We've done some user stakeholder workshops and all of that sort of thing. We've started to work on taxonomy. We thought that the challenge was going to be that, you know, this is a software development. Basically, we'll build a library and, you know, the people will come and that will be the problem is, you know, how to build it. But we had some other issues, which Victoria thinks.
So as Peter said, we anticipated that the big challenge would be the development and the deployment of the software. And the reason we were confident that would be the case was because the processes and templates are already in place for the development of the taxonomy and for the development of the online repository. And so that's kind of our expectation as we started this process. However, we did come across a number of issues. In terms of terminology, across our multidisciplinary team, there are differences in interpretation. And they soon surfaced in relation to specific terms. So for the computer scientists, they understood a benchmark as a baseline for evaluation, something that was reproducible, something that allowed for repeatable objective comparison. But for other members of the team who weren't computer scientists, a benchmark is a management tool for best practice, or it's something that had standout qualities rather than being a standard for comparative evaluation. Even the terms use case and choice proved ambiguous, with use case being interpreted as an experimental scenario and a script for system requirements. And there was also debate around conditions for genuine choice compared with perceived choice in those interactions that Peter talked about. When it came to scope, we took the characteristics of uncertainty and vulnerability that Lee and C had established in situations that require human trust and automation. And we proposed that risk and choice would be the qualifying characteristics for an evaluation of trust. Yet we found use cases that had no genuine risk in them, in which participants in a non-risky environment were asked to imagine a future scenario of uncertainty and vulnerability. So risk wasn't actually present in that scenario. It became a scenario that evaluated perceived trustworthiness. And we found that risk is often added to any scenario in the form of time pressure or a gain score. So the whole presence of risk and uncertainty became quite fluid for us and ambiguous. When it came to the model, the object our taxonomy describes is an experimental use case scenario capable of achieving benchmark status in the context of trust-related HRI AS research. And for us, the meta characteristic is the intrinsicality. And critically, all of the independent variables, such as voice or appearance or robot type, or some of the variables we've heard about this morning, they're not intrinsic to the experimental use case, and they would be changed whenever the benchmark is repurposed or transferred to a different domain or a different environment. And so we found that not all use cases involving risk and choice, but involved risk and choice. There were also use cases that involved priming interactions. So there was no risk or choice actually present. It was more to do with the quality of the interaction between the robot and the participant in the anticipation of a later interaction that would involve risk. So it was much more complex than we expected. So as for stakeholder expectation, the common practice in explaining a user study is describing the use case scenario as a task with the elements such as the design, the domain, the robot type, the sample size and composition. But in our representation, a use case focuses on the intrinsic interaction between the human and the robot, rendering all the other elements as less important. And this opens up different differences in representation between the likely users on the one hand, the likely users of the online library, and how the use cases are presented in the library. And how do we explain this to library users? We know from the survey that we conducted that stakeholders will expect to search for use cases by domain, whether it's health or education or home assistance, as we've already heard. Whereas our library removes this information because it impedes transferability. So it was a really complex contradiction for us. And finally, on inappropriate trust, we hope that our library will encourage the development of socially beneficial autonomous systems that are trustworthy in principle and trusted in practice. But as a public asset, there is inevitably a risk of misuse by bad actors with bad intent who want to develop autonomous systems that are trusted in practice, but are not trustworthy at all. And across all of the use cases, we found no consensus on the measuring of appropriate trust. So overall, whilst we anticipated principally just a software problem in the development of the use case library, these multiple, more nuanced challenges surfaced. And I'll hand back to Peter, who'll talk about the next steps.
Yes, so there are a lot of the next steps are to do with the software development. We've got to build it, we've got to get people to use it, and we've got to maintain it and make it better. But really, this one is, it's nice to be able to put it in 3 words with a bullet point, but I think that it can hide a world of pain. So we've started with our wireframes and so on, but I'll leave you with the references and our email addresses, and please use them if you please use the library when it happens. Please contact us if you have anything to say about the model, and also if you've got anything to say about those challenges.
Questions?
Thank you for the talk. I'm actually working in transit-based and in robot interaction and
Right.
robot collaboration, and I fully understand the issues with it, with being a trust is so highly subjective, and that makes it very difficult to measure. And then, I mean, in our study, we use the established questionnaire, but
Yes.
what some subjects found that some questions are highly irrelevant with the current scenario that they're experiencing. So, and then every time that makes you that creates an issue, you create another questionnaire which like creates another metric. You put alphas Chromebook, it holds up statistically, but that really impedes creating a benchmark.
Yeah.
How do you think, is there any way to get out of this? And also, I think like in our study, we looked at power dynamics as well. So trust is not a standalone thing as well. It is affected by a lot of different social constructs. So will you be adding like a feature or other possible effects to trust to like have different kind of benchmarks, or can you isolate that and then have an actual benchmark, which is I think another big question.
So I mean, I wonder if part of the solution, we're looking at the scenarios, and like you said, well, every time you use a different scenario, then the questionnaire may become irrelevant. Like you've got some of the questions don't really fit. Well, we haven't looked at trying to match the 2 things together because there's quite a lot of work on the questionnaires. We're just sort of focusing in on this piece. But I can see that it could be useful certainly once you've established these are the really useful scenarios to say, and these are the really useful questionnaires that go with them. I don't know if there's anything.
No, I totally agree with that. And also I think you've absolutely nailed the key issue here, which is the relational aspect of trust, the subjectivity and how you deliver sort of effective measures for that in a way that can be applied and transferred and relevant across different domains. It's a really big challenge, and it's been messier than we anticipated.
Also, like, because you mentioned in the risk aspect of it,
Yeah.
some scenarios are like very less risky, or
Yes.
there's no risk involved at
That's
all.
right.
But that's still like and a robot error still degrades trust, and then that's still relevant because that might lead to people not adopting the technology or like abandoning the technology. Like, for example, if I'm not using Siri a lot because I'm Turkish and then it cannot understand my English very well, so
Right.
I distrust it and I just don't use it at all. So that's like an example. There's no risk associated with it. I can like still use it, but it's so much pain for me that I don't use it. So I think that makes it's difficult to create another benchmark too, because then you have to have like, maybe you have to have some scenarios, use cases that have low risk, and then high risk scenarios as well, like multiple benchmarks for different
Well,
levels of risk.
well, I guess that becomes the variable. So what we want to look at is strictly the use case. So there's lots of things that have been said, like the passing the cup. So we would look at reducing it right down to passing the cup. So, you know, and at that level, when you've got that piece, now you can make as many changes as you like and measure what the impact was. And then you find out, is that a really useful, that piece, is that a really useful use case that could be used in lots of different situations? Or, you know, even the navigational one with the might be it's navigation specific, but with the robot approaching a different table, how much do I trust that robot? You know, it's you could measure even with that sort of thing, and you might only be changing what it looks like, how quickly it moves. Those are the sort of things. But and that's similar. You could change the level of risk. It would be something you would change, but the scenario could otherwise stay the same. That's what we're hoping for, really.
So it's a library of scenarios rather than a traditional library of experiments. It's not a literature review library. It's a library that focuses purely on experimental design. So,
is there another question in the back? Yeah, or maybe Shelley, you come get set up while we are down.
Thank you for the talk. So I don't work on trust. I do work on navigation, and I'm actually curious about how you guys are building your taxonomy.